Hey guys, tonight we will step into a strange and shadowed corner of the Middle Ages, where leaves are left to dry upon the rafters above the hearth, where murky jars of infused spirits rest in silence, and where thin trails of smoke rise within church walls, guiding the mind into distant realms. You can almost see those careful hands crushing the seeds of henbane, the monks burning incense in sealed air, or the poor adding a little more strong drink to forget the cold, the hunger, and the harsh commandments that bind their days. Indeed, getting high is not a creation of the modern world. It has walked beside humanity ever since we first understood pain, fear, and the yearning to drift away from reality for just a moment. So before we journey onward together, take a little time to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I am doing here. And if you're watching deep into the night, leave your location and your local time in the comments, so I may know from which distant places we wander together this evening. Now then, turn off the lights, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, and let us begin our gentle passage into tonight's story. If you lived in a small village in medieval Europe, you would quickly learn that the human body and mind are never permitted enough rest, for labour and fear walk side by side like two inseparable shadows. There is no painkiller, no modern sedative, and no one to tell you that the soul also needs healing. Yet you still must rise when the sky is dark, work until your hands turn stiff like wood, and your thoughts grow heavy with worries you cannot properly name, and in such a world nature becomes the only escape, the only path by which people might step, however briefly, away from reality. Bundles of dried leaves hanging from the roof beams, roots dug up beneath the moonlight, and murky jars of liquor hidden carefully in the corner of the room. Not merely objects, but small doorways leading to rare moments of peace. At night, when the fire crackles in the hearth and flickers against the wooden walls, you toss a few pinches of herbs onto the coals and watch the smoke rise like a veil of mist, gently swallowing the wrinkles of life. The scent of plants slips into your lungs, your shoulders loosen, your eyelids blink slower, and reality drifts just a little farther away. No one here calls it intoxication. They say, "The Lord grants the mind its rest," and the saying sounds reasonable enough that no further explanation is needed. In the church just a few steps away, the monks burn incense throughout long ceremonies. The heavy fragrance clots the air, pressing down upon every thought in your head. And when the sacred hymn stretches on like a lullaby meant for the soul itself, you can no longer distinguish where prayer ends and the beginning of a dreamlike vision begins. They call it revelation, a divine sign. No one wishes to admit that the rising smoke has gently nudged their minds across the edge of wakefulness. Meanwhile, in the smoke-darkened kitchens of the villagers, midwives and local healers carry knowledge they never need to write down. Henbane eases pain, but can scatter the mind into chaos. Valerian invites deep sleep, though sometimes it may refuse to return you. And certain mushrooms make the darkness seem to move and the colours too vivid to be real. Any of these could save a person, or destroy them, depending on just a pinch more or less. But medieval people accepted that risk, for pain and despair were far more terrifying. When a strong cup of monastery liquor can make you forget the winter's cold, or the overseer's shouting, you will drink. When a breath of fragrant smoke can drive away the memory of a sickness that just swept through the village, you will sit closer to the flames. And when those few moments where the mind floats in a soft haze are the only thing that helps you survive until tomorrow, you will seek out that haze by any means you can. In this world, the line between healing, praying, and fleeing is terribly thin. A person lost in visions might be seen as touched by God, or possessed by demons depending on who is watching and what they choose to believe. And you realise a truth history rarely speaks aloud. Surviving the Middle Ages was not only a struggle against disease, hunger, or harsh laws, it was a struggle against one's own thoughts when the darkness arrived. So if people turned to herbs, incense, or drink to alter their sense of reality, it was not weakness. It was a silent form of resilience. When they could not change the world, they changed a few minutes of how they felt within it, just enough to keep from collapsing. And in those fleeting instants, amid what has been called the darkest era of history, humanity still found a hidden escape. Curled within the soft, rising breath of smoke from a few dried leaves that seemed so ordinary, to understand why medieval people so often turned to smoke, drink, and herbs to soothe the mind, you must look into the spiritual structure of society at that time. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, the life of Western Europe lay under the near-absolute influence of the Catholic Church, the sole institution entrusted with the authority to interpret what occurred inside the human mind. When the sun set, there was no electricity to hold the light. Darkness fell so quickly that one might easily forget they lived in a physical world at all. No one understood that stress, pain, or lack of sleep could create a sense of unease within the head. Every inner disturbance had to take on a supernatural meaning. If you suffered nightmare, they would say it was a personal warning meant for you alone. If you heard strange voices, it was a trial God himself was observing. There was no language for mental illness. Everything had to be placed under the jurisdiction of religion. And the church did not shy away from altered states. They employed them. In ritual ceremonies, incense and fragrant resins were burned in sealed spaces, a tradition that dated back to the earliest Christian emperors who sought to heighten the sacred atmosphere of the church. As you breathed in that thick perfume, with the hymns rising in steady cadence and candlelight flickering like distant constellations, your mind drifted in rhythm with the divine, and you naturally believed you were drawing closer to God. But the boundary between the holy and the dangerous was always present. Should your visions align with doctrine, they were a mark of honour. Yet if your story strayed, you might be seen as a soul brushed by darker forces. The very same state of mind could alter your fate in a single heartbeat, depending on how it was interpreted. And in daily life, you still needed practical means to withstand the weight of existence. Monasteries, especially within ascetic traditions, brewed alcohol both for their meals and to provide villagers with a drink far safer than the contaminated water outside. Wine and ale warmed the body and eased the constant throbbing carried by every labourer. Meanwhile, midwives and folk healers relied on herbs to summon sleep more quickly, or to soften the fear of winter, land taxes, or illness. These remedies were never seen as weakness. They were how people protected themselves. Around you, war could break out at any moment, and plague might sweep through the village in only a few nights. Death was not a distant idea, but a frequent visitor knocking at the door. When reality is that fragile, people cling tighter to religion in order to explain both the world outside and the world within. Thus, shifting one's state of consciousness during the Middle Ages was not indulgence nor rebellion. It was survival in a society that tested the human body and spirit without mercy. Lacking the language of science, people coped using the language of faith and community. And through that, though life was harsher than anything we can easily imagine, they still found a way to continue, one day and then another, beneath the long shadow of history. And once you grow accustomed to having your mind interpreted through belief and devotion, you begin to notice that the things which calm your thoughts, incense smoke, strong spirits, healing leaves, are not simply chance discoveries. They arise from a system quietly woven into the fabric of society for ages, a natural supply chain maintained by those who kept the knowledge of herbs, fragrances, and how to use them. This supply chain had no storefront and no written contracts. Yet its importance ran so deep that without it, the mental strength of an entire community might crumble with ease. Look around, and you will see its three principal sources: the monasteries, where monks tended vast gardens of medicinal plants; the apothecaries in the towns, where medical lore was preserved in black ink and professional pride; and the folk practitioners, midwives, healers, cunning folk, who held no high status yet possessed secrets that the entire village depended on whenever the body or the mind faltered. The monastery was the most trusted source of official care. In an age without hospitals as we know them, the monks were both readers of scripture and keepers of botanical knowledge. They cultivated flowers, roots, and leaves in their seasonal gardens, recording their uses in manuscripts copied by hand. They knew which herbs soothed the aches of labour, and which helped the elderly sleep more peacefully through the long winter nights. When villagers were in despair, a monk would offer a small vial of tonic, or a few dried leaves along with a brief word of guidance. No explanation was needed. If the monastery provided it, it was safe to use. And since the monks also brewed beer and wine, these strong drinks naturally became part of the remedy to keep the spirit steady. People of the time did not separate healing of the body from calming of the mind. The two always walked together, and the monastery stood at the centre of both. Beyond the monastery walls, another form of care appeared within the towns: small apothecaries, where a few were permitted to sell herbs and what they called medicine. These shops often sat near the market or the great church, where crowds flowed through. They traded in fragrant resins from the southern lands, hardened pellets burned to drive away odour, fend off evil, and ease the mind. That scent, at times worth its weight in gold, was used in both religious rites and daily life. If someone in the household lay awake or trembled with fear, a little resin burned on the coals might bring comfort. Apothecaries boasted that their goods came from seafaring merchants, distant forests, or warm climates where strong medicinal plants grew. You could never be certain how much of that tale was true, but you knew their wares worked. Yet the most essential part of the supply chain belonged to those outside any official system: the midwives, village healers, and the so-called cunning folk. They wore no clerical robes and hung no sign above their doors. They lived like everyone else, but all knew where to find them when life turned difficult. They knew how to seek mushrooms from shaded groves to numb pain, and which roots, taken sparingly, brought sleep, but taken more boldly, could hush fear entirely. They were the ones you called when a child cried without end or when an adult felt crushed by unspoken dread. But such power placed them in a shadowed corner of society, respected quietly, yet easily suspected should misfortune strike. The very herbs that made them saviours could also make them targets of accusation. Looking at this division, you come to understand that medieval knowledge did not flow through a single channel. It wound through hidden pathways where religion, trade, and folk tradition each played a role. The striking truth is that no matter its source, these substances were broadly accepted as valid means to help people endure the weight of each day. No one asked you to justify their use, for everyone understood life was heavy enough that sometimes a bit of herb was something you simply could not do without. Observe this system closely, and one thing becomes clear: even in an age deprived of many necessities, the need for mental relief was never taken lightly. The monks prepared medicine with faith in God. The apothecaries sold their wares through knowledge and commerce. The midwives and nature-wise villagers carried their secrets from generation to generation. Together, these three forces coexisted, complementing and tempering one another, creating a balance that kept people from collapsing under the burden of existence. This natural supply chain stands as proof that, though medieval society may appear rigid and tightly bound by religious authority, the human spirit still found ways to adjust itself. When faith is the foundation of all things, anything that keeps the mind from falling apart is held in esteem, so long as it does not step beyond the community's boundaries. People needed such help to preserve the humanity within them, the part that knows rest, endures hardship, and continues to hope. Once you've seen how the keepers of herbal knowledge operated like a secret network sustaining the community's spirit, you realise something even more crucial. All of it worked only if used correctly. And in the Middle Ages, before modern pharmacology existed, dosage was the fragile boundary between saving a life and causing harm. People trusted herbs because they had no other choice. The Crusades brought back to Europe new sense and knowledge, especially from the Islamic world, which had advanced far ahead in the art of healing. Thanks to this, apothecaries began to appear in towns near trade centres, where merchants exchanged fragrant resins from the East, seeds and curious powders used in medicine. Meanwhile, monasteries served as the laboratories of their age. Monks consulted ancient medical texts from Greece and Arabia, copied into Latin, then experimented with extracting active properties using alcohol, hot water, or oils. But even with references at hand, results depended more on experience and intuition than any perfected formula. Herbal tea was the most common method. Leaves were boiled into a drink that calmed the body after heavy labour, but if you added a few extra handfuls, drowsiness could become overwhelming. During times of plague, deep sleep was desperately desired, yet it also left people abandoned to fate. When the body weakened, sleeping too deeply meant no one noticed when breath grew shorter and silent. Herbal liquors grew more widespread once monks learned production techniques from Arab physicians. A small sip might ease pain or lift a spirit weighed down by grief, a familiar burden amid recurring famine and death. But one sip more, and the mind tilted off balance, words slipping out untamed. In a world that attributed every unusual behaviour to sinister forces, one careless moment with medicated drink could mark a person as disrespectful, even possessed. Tinctures, which monasteries began using to treat battlefield wounds, numbed pain more effectively. Yet they were so strong that one could easily lose a sense of limits. Vapours gathering in a closed room sometimes left both patient and healer drifting into confusion. Warriors returning from distant campaigns carried wounds and haunting memories, and sometimes the only way they could sleep was to drink something that stunned the mind so swiftly that nightmares could no longer reach them. Salves and herbal fumigation belonged to the realm of folk remedy. Women and cunning folk used them to adjust both body and spirit. When overwork turned joints rigid with pain, they rubbed thick balms onto the skin until sensation faded. But the body absorbed faster than they imagined, and a mixture only one branch or root off measure could send the user into unconsciousness within minutes. Herbal smoke became common during epidemics, when people feared poisoned air was the cause of illness. They inhaled the scented vapour believing it pushed away foul forces, a belief rooted in Hippocratic and Galenic theory still strong in monasteries and royal courts. These practices revealed a truth. The equation between dosage and effect was a gamble. No precise scales existed, no ingredient analysis, no concept of overdose, only whispered warnings. A little brings sleep, too much, and you will not wake. Religion helped maintain an invisible system of judgment. If the effect aligned with hope, it was a blessing. If it turned astray, it was the mark of evil. Folk healers therefore walked upon thin ice, trusted when the cure worked, but swiftly accused of dark interference when someone reacted violently or slipped too far into the void. Many later witch hunts were born from the fear of the very herbal knowledge the community had long depended on. Looking back at history, one truth becomes unmistakable. Medieval people understood that the line between remedy and poison was perilously thin, yet they still walked it, because no safer path existed. A body aching beyond endurance, they used leaves, a spirit too weary to continue. They drank herb-steeped wine, sleep refusing to come. They prayed amid the rising incense smoke and hoped God would guard them through the night. It was not ignorance or superstition. It was a survival strategy in an age stalked by war, plague, and scarcity. In the darkness of history, medieval people found a light of their own. Not dazzling, but just bright enough to keep the mind from collapsing before dawn arrived. By now you've begun to see that in this world, every shift of the mind carries both hope and danger. And then, you hear the name of a plant whispered only when someone truly needs it. Henbane. You notice it along the roadside, rising to your knee, its leaves thick and slightly rough, as though they would rather not be touched. Its flowers are strange, a pale mixture of purple and brown, marked by dark veins that make you think of something not entirely friendly. In the quiet, someone murmurs, "That plant makes people forget pain." Then another voice, more wary, "But it can make them forget themselves as well." You do not fully understand, not until you witness henbane used for the first time. A man lies on a wooden bed, groaning as old wounds flare after a day in the fields. The midwife hands him a small cup, henbane steeped in liquor, a liquid so bitter he must pinch his nose to swallow. Moments later, his shoulders sink, his breathing steadies, his eyelids fall. The whole room seems to lighten, and everyone exhales in relief. How miraculous, you think. Yet the midwife looks at the cup with uneasy eyes. She whispers, almost warning herself, "No more than that." And you realize that even those who administer the plant do not fully trust what they hold. Henbane can be mixed into beer. In a crowded tavern within a labourer's district, you notice a few barrels with a sweetness that spreads slowly, making patrons laugh without pause. Only with careful observation do you notice that not everyone laughs from joy. Some gaze dreamily into a dark corner, lips trembling as they whisper to someone unseen. You do not dare question it, for in this society the line between being touched by God and pulled by darker forces is as thin as a single breath. Sitting near the hearth, you see the innkeeper quietly toss a few dried leaves into the flames. A sharp scent rises, mingling with the warm air, and your head begins to feel pleasantly light. No one acknowledges it aloud, but all know that burning henbane sends the mind floating with the smoke. You glance toward the window. For an instant, the passerby outside seems to walk slower than they should. In the blink of an eye, you wonder, is it the light or the smoke? You find no answer, and perhaps no one here truly needs one. In the villager's home, henbane salve is kept carefully in a small jar, used only when the pain is real. People spread it on swollen knees or aching backs. When the pain fades, they sleep, but they often wake with stories of wandering through places no one else has ever seen. Not all dreams are gentle. Sometimes they sit up gasping, their eyes still tangled between waking and the dark. Then they bow their heads, make the holy sign, and blame themselves for using too much. In a monk's handwritten notes you find discreet remarks. Henbane amplifies the voices in one's head. You become curious. One day, in the monastery infirmary, you hear patients speaking to the shadows. They describe faces that no one else sees, recount tales that no one believes, and by the dim candlelight you cannot entirely dismiss the thought that they might truly see something. No one explains it with neurology or science. All explanations lead back to faith. Either God is speaking, or something else has slipped in. Henbane reveals what the mind hides best: exhaustion of the spirit. When reality grows too heavy, a single touch from this plant can push the mind aside, sometimes into peace, sometimes into chaos. You begin to understand. Henbane does not merely treat the body, it reaches into the deepest chambers of perception, the very place medieval people believed the soul resided. Thus, society's view of henbane is forever double-edged. If it grants someone peaceful sleep and recovery, a blessing of nature. If someone screams into the night from visions, a crisis of faith. You realize that what makes henbane frightening is not its effect on the body, but its effect on how others see you. To take it is to gamble. Tonight you may escape pain, or tomorrow you may become the subject of whispers behind closed doors. And yet, watching those exhausted faces seeking a fragment of rest, you understand why henbane never vanished from medieval life. It gave people a choice, not the easiest choice, nor the safest, but the only one that allowed them to believe their mind might rest, even briefly. And so, in an age where darkness stretched longer than hope, henbane became a secret switch within human consciousness. Just a touch, and you could step back from suffering, or wander too far from yourself. The more you observe the world of medieval herbs, the more you realize that some plants do not merely soothe pain or lull the body into sleep. They reach deep into the mind, confusing the line between medicine and the mystical. Among them, mandrake, the strange, toxic root, holds a special place as a symbol of the delicate boundary between knowledge and belief. When you first see a mandrake root laid out on a folk healer's table, you may flinch a little. Its shape resembles the human form, with two long branches like legs and sometimes root filaments that look like arms. This human-like appearance led medieval people to believe mandrake was not just a plant, but a being with intentions of its own. They passed down the tale that the mandrake screams when pulled from the earth, a scream powerful enough to steal the life or sanity of anyone who dares touch it. So, to harvest one, a cunning trick was used. The root was tied to a dog's collar, and the dog was driven to run. When the root burst free and the scream rang out, the poor animal paid the price in the human's stead. There was no biological truth in this, yet the fear behind it was very real. People believed the root possessed a dangerous will that humans could only approach indirectly. In medieval medicine, mandrake was used as an anesthetic in moments when the body had to be compelled to endure harm. Bones to be set, deep wounds to be cleaned, teeth to be pulled. Patients drank or inhaled its vapours so pain would fade. They often described the feeling as being pulled outside their own body, watching from a safer distance. But sometimes mandrake's effect wandered far beyond its purpose. Visions appeared, strange and vivid, unseen by others. Under the gaze of that age, hallucination became holy revelation. Mandrake also found its way into salves and medicinal liquors, especially for chronic pains that had no clear cause. When sleep drifted too far from reach, mandrake offered a way to regain a few hours apart from exhaustion and relentless thought. But after such deep slumber, the mind could wake blurred and confused, unsure where memories ended and illusions began. This left the plant under constant suspicion. It worked, but who controlled the mind during its use? The person, or the plant itself? Thus, mandrake was guarded with great caution, sometimes kept in a leather pouch like a sacred charm. Some households treated it as a talisman, believing it protected them from evil or sudden misfortune. Yet those who feared its power avoided it entirely. insisting that anyone too skilled with mandrake must be walking dangerously close to sorcery. In a time when the Church defined spiritual order, any hint of a connection between mandrake and the otherworldly was monitored closely. A useful remedy could quickly become evidence of forbidden power. This double view reveals mandrake perched exactly at the intersection of medicine and superstition. People could not deny its effectiveness, yet they could not silence the fear of what the mind might lose if handled incorrectly. Each use of mandrake was a deliberate wager: endure endless pain, or temporarily abandon reality. In a society where suffering had no gentle cure, the choice often leaned toward the root, even if it meant drifting for hours through dreams both comforting and impossible to name. Mandrake reminds you that medieval nature was never gentle. Humans relied on the natural world for healing, but nature constantly tested the boundaries of what they understood. What they called magic or devilry was often simply the body reacting to something for which they lacked words, and in this herbal supply chain of the Middle Ages, mandrake stands as a powerful reminder that healing the mind has never been simple. Thus, mandrake's place in history lies not only in its medical value, but in how it exposed humanity's constant unease with its own consciousness. A root shaped like a person waits beneath the soil, daring someone to pull it free, and to accept that in this exchange they may gain the deep sleep they desperately need, or be cast into a realm where no one will believe what they witnessed by morning. Within the world of medieval herbs, belladonna was a plant forever tangled in contradiction, feared as a poison, yet coveted as a tool of power. Since the era of Greece and Rome, physicians had used it to ease spasms and numb pain, and that knowledge found its way into European monasteries and city apothecaries. But the Church watched belladonna with wary eyes, for it did not merely soothe the body, it reached straight into the eyes and brain. You touch a single drop of a belladonna mixture to your tongue, your pupils widen as though staring into a blazing light, though everything around you remains dim. Nobles and courtiers once used this effect in secret, letting their gaze grow deeper, more enchanting at grand banquets. Yet you feel your heartbeat quicken, your breathing slow. And this is when belladonna reveals its other face, a shift too tiny to measure, and its charm shatters into disorientation. In the monastery infirmary, belladonna was diluted into painkillers, especially for those wounded in skirmishes or twisted by sickness. Monks, copying ancient medical writings into their manuscripts, noted how belladonna could loosen muscle and grant the afflicted brief freedom from bodily torment. Yet in those same manuscripts they added a quiet warning: trust it only in part. For belladonna did not stop at easing pain, it invited hallucination into thought. Those who misjudged the dose spoke of figures moving through empty space, or voices calling softly from no place at all. In a society that saw consciousness as a doorway into the divine world, such experiences were examined with frightening scrutiny. A vision that matched doctrine could elevate someone to sacred status, but a step beyond the script, and they became a threat to order. Thus belladonna stood on a boundary no one wished to cross. When you stare at your own trembling hand and wonder if it still belongs to you, the plant proves it has never agreed to be controlled. In the countryside, belladonna was hidden by cunning folk and used only for suffering beyond endurance. Yet those very healers faced suspicion in witch trials. Anything that altered one's mind was easily labelled a transaction with demons. History records accusations born from delirium after medicine, where belladonna's effects were twisted into evidence against its healer. Meanwhile, in glittering palaces, belladonna served beauty and power. This uneasy coexistence reveals a harsh truth of the time. The most dangerous thing was not the plant, but how society interpreted its effects. You brush your fingertip along your eyelid, the world brightens strangely, as though space itself leans closer. For a moment you understand why they named it the deadly beautiful. It grants what humans crave, allure, relief from pain, the feeling of slipping beyond reality, while stealing the stability of perception that everyone needs to survive in a community. In the Middle Ages, belladonna became a mirror showing two desperate needs: to escape pain and to still be seen as normal in the eyes of others. Used correctly, both were preserved. Used poorly, both vanished in a single breath. And when night stretched longer than hope, belladonna was still chosen, not for safety, but because another night of suffering was more frightening than the risk of losing one's grip on the world. And once you see how belladonna could make the gaze irresistible while uprooting one's sense of reality, you begin to understand why medieval Europe birthed tales that blur the line between medicine and the supernatural. From this very ambiguity emerged one of history's most iconic images, the witch riding a broom. Not from fairy tales, but from perilous experiments with anesthetic and hallucinogenic herbs. At that time, pain relief, sleep, and mental calm relied heavily on Solanaceae plants like henbane and belladonna. But midwives and cunning folk pushed further, crafting strong ointments that acted swiftly on the nervous system. These mixtures were blended with animal fat and applied to the skin, numbing pain while lifting the mind from the body. They described the sensation as flying out of oneself. What made these ointments extraordinary was where they worked best: on intimate mucous membranes, where absorption was fast and direct. To remain discreet, and to avoid the church's watchful suspicion, the most accessible place for application was not the hospital bed, but the private realm of women. You spread a thin layer upon the most sensitive skin. A tingling heat rises in just a few heartbeats, and your mind grows feather-light, as though your body has been left behind. Without leaving the room, you feel movement. Space undulates like slow waves, and the floor is no longer the only stable ground. This is the pharmacological mechanism behind the sensation of flight that both trial records and medical writings once described. So when users needed to apply the ointment somewhere hard to reach, they chose long, smooth objects to carry the medicine to hidden places, and the broom became the most practical tool. No one set out to make it a symbol, yet a woman gripping a broomstick while slipping into another state was enough to seed a myth that would endure centuries. You hold the broom for balance, the ointment lifts gravity away, and your mind slips from its ordinary prison. To the user, this is freedom from pain and the nameless fear that haunts this age. But to those watching from the outside, it is deviance, a breach of religious and moral order. The church had long distrusted anything that altered consciousness outside of worship, and even more when women were the ones holding that secret power. The power of tending bodies, birthing life, easing pain, realms already deemed dangerous to control. When someone applied the salve and claimed they soared beyond their flesh, their words were swiftly twisted into proof of a pact with darkness. And across the expanding witch trials, every tool of healing, even a house broom, became evidence of the forbidden. Ointment or execution, that was the wager. The irony is sharp. What today could be explained by neuropharmacology was then caged under religious and legal suspicion. Humans have always yearned to escape reality when it grows unbearable. But the medieval world saw that yearning as moral rebellion. You sit still a while, the ointment's haze still clinging to your thoughts, and you understand why tales of broomstick flight spread so powerfully. They were not fantasy. They were experiences scarred by interpretation. History's myths often grow from the imbalance between what people feel and what society allows them to say. A salve and a broom are just ordinary objects, but together they became a symbol of collective fear. Fear of what women know, fear of what changes the mind, fear that the human spirit might briefly escape the rules held by power. And so, in the long medieval night, as bodies sought relief from pain and minds sought refuge from dread, the sensation of flight was judged rebellion, even when all a person wanted was a moment of quiet peace within their own skin. After the stories filled with suspicion surrounding folk ointments, we step into a space entirely opposite in nature, the church. Here, altering the state of consciousness is not only accepted, but carefully orchestrated with sanctity. Since Christianity spread through Europe, the burning of incense and sacred resins became an inseparable part of liturgy. The fragrance seeps into every crevice of stone architecture. You take a deep breath and feel your chest open, your mind settling, as though the burdens of daily life have been locked outside the great doors of the cathedral. Incense does more than hide the scent of dampness and crowded bodies. It produces a gentle sedative effect, slowing the breath, softening the pulse, and making the spirit more receptive to the sacred. This is essential during those long ceremonies that demand full attention and unwavering devotion. As the chant rises steadily and candlelight sways along drifting smoke, you sense the entire world slowing by half a beat, just enough for faith to slip in without resistance from hunger or the gnawing weight of worry. To the medieval mind, incense carried meanings far beyond any biological effect. The church taught that smoke rising represented prayers carried to God, and the calming of the mind was a sign of grace. Yet it was precisely this easing of anxiety that pushed people into a half-dreaming state, perfect for religion to reach into the deepest chambers of the soul. Though monks lacked scientific language to describe what incense truly did, they understood its collective power well. A community breathing under one fragrant influence would more readily unite beneath one belief. It was a quiet power, yet unshakably strong. You never name it, but you feel its influence in your every movement. Incense also reflected the political vision of the age. The ownership and trade of precious resins, frankincense, myrrh from distant southern lands, were controlled by the powerful. The church controlled ritual, and through ritual controlled the spiritual experience of the population. Not everyone was allowed to burn such sacred scents at home. Their place was the holy space. Thus, calmness became a psychological property of the church, a reason people returned to faith whenever life darkened around them. The mind-softening effects of incense never caused dramatic hallucination like henbane or belladonna, and that stability is exactly what allowed religion to thrive quietly across generations. People left the church with eased hearts. They believed that peace came from God, not from the aromatic compounds settling in their lungs, and the church did not need to deny any of it, only allow the belief to continue. Standing among the praying crowd as smoke thins into pale ribbons around the candles, you realize something. Here, no one must risk delirium to escape hardship. Religion provides a socially honoured method of altering consciousness, a temporary softening that does not threaten order. In all of history, few forms of gentle power have been so effective. The church does not need whip or sword. It only needs incense to linger in the air, and people will willingly walk deeper into faith, calmer, more obedient, and ready to believe that every hardship, no matter how cruel, holds a divine purpose. Thus, cathedral incense became a vital spiritual social tool, sustaining people through an age of uncertainty while sustaining the authority that claimed to protect their souls. A single scent, a slowing breath, one brief moment of quiet, enough to keep an entire community standing through the darkest years of medieval life. Where cathedral incense softened the mind, you could step outside and instantly encounter another, far more familiar, mental remedy. Alcohol. No ritual required, no prayer. Alcohol slipped into every corner of medieval life like a lifeline, keeping people afloat in a world harsher than we often imagine. In an age where clean water was scarce, where rivers near settlements served as convenient channels for waste, small beer, a low-alcohol brew, became the daily drink of both adults and children. It was safer than river water and carried enough calories to sustain a body through long, laborious days. You take a sip of small beer, slightly sour, a bit cloudy but gentle. Its mild alcohol content relaxes the body without weighing down the mind. Every kitchen kept a cask ready like a household reservoir, and no one considered it a luxury. But when the sun set and exhaustion rose, life required more than safe hydration. It needed a small retreat from reality. Mead and stronger spirits became universal medicine for every ache. The ache of the body, of grief, or simply the winter cold burrowing into bone. Taverns near market squares and city gates filled with voices. Places not just to refuel, but to exist freely, without judgment. Nearly every class found a place there. Peasants after toil, soldiers awaiting orders, merchants biding time until the next market dawn. And in their laughter, you realize a simple truth. Sometimes a few gulps are enough to make life feel lighter. It is fascinating that monasteries, guardians of the mind for religion, were also the master brewers of the era. Benedictine monks and others, striving for self-sufficiency and funds to aid their communities, meticulously refined brewing techniques, crafting better flavours, making alcohol both nourishment and remedy. Their manuscript notes describe experiments with spices and herbs, mint for digestion, hops for calming the nerves, and occasionally stronger botanicals to dull agony during brutal care. Thus, alcohol occupied a curious middle ground, rooted in everyday life, yet carried by sacred knowledge. Not everyone understood its medicinal logic, but everyone understood its relief. You set your cup on a rough wooden table polished by years of spilled ale. From a stranger nearby, faint stories drift. Taxes, distant wars, a plague that passed through the next village. Alcohol didn't erase these things, but it dulled the sharp edge of fear. Medieval people lacked words like stress relief, but they understood the brain must be unburdened occasionally. During feast days in the religious calendar, alcohol amplified collective joy. When cups were raised together, social divides briefly faded. Nobles might drink stronger brew, but their smiles looked no different from the smiles of peasants. In this way, alcohol became a social binder, something laws could never fully suppress. Of course, alcohol held its darker half. To drink too freely risked losing dignity, and the church constantly warned against indulgence. Yet in the era's relentless hardships, war, famine, disease returning as predictably as seasons, alcohol helped people hold on to their humanity, to laugh, to speak, to forget fear just long enough to breathe again. When pain in bone or heart had no other cure, the bottle on the table became the one remedy everyone understood and everyone forgave. And in the moment when warmth loosens your shoulders, you glimpse alcohol's real place in history, not a stimulant to flee life, but a lantern held against the dark, just bright enough to survive another night. Looking back, We might say alcohol was the spiritual water system of the Middle Ages, a quiet irrigation for the mind flowing through every class, every home, every night when someone needed to remember there was still a tomorrow. In a world with little support from medicine or science, sometimes a sip, light or strong, was the only thing that carried a person through the cold night, toward the faintest suggestion of dawn. Alcohol softened the harshness of life, but even in the simplest meals, the Middle Ages hid another source of mental disturbance that people never chose: ergot, a parasitic fungus that clung to rye and barley. In damp seasons and during long-term grain storage, strange black kernels, curved like a bird's talon, mingled quietly into the flour of daily bread. No one saw them as a threat. Grain was precious, and wasting even a handful was a luxury few could afford. So in years of famine or war-disrupted harvests, you bite into a harmless-looking brown loaf, unaware that you have swallowed a natural chemical powerful enough to rewrite your entire nervous system. Soon, muscles twitch as though trying to escape the body, fingers and toes burn or go numb, vision wavers like heat above a flame. The sensation, a holy fire crawling from skin to bone, is both agony and a terrifying sign from the unseen powers that govern fate. In villages where ergot infestation spread, collective hallucination erupted. Children, elders and workers all describing figures in corners, whispering voices and demons lurking just beyond firelight. Benedictine records and local chronicles tell of groups running into the streets, dancing without control until collapse, as if bound by invisible strings. Priests called it frenzied devotion, and entire processions wandered from town to town, dancing, crying for salvation, terrifying those who watched and could not explain the madness that moved them. You stumble among them, your legs refusing to rest though your mind begs for stillness. Sweat runs bitter across your lips. The eyes around you mirror the same panic as your own. Outsiders call it a curse, but inside the body it is simply the fungus taking command. Ergot recognized no social boundary. Peasant or cleric, a tainted loaf dragged both into torment. Monastic writings describe religious visions, the sick hearing angels and devils fighting over their souls. At the height of heresy hunts, such symptoms became swift proof of demonic influence, punishable upon entire communities. Some places revived ancient rites of purification, praying through the night to banish what they believed was Satan's plague. Yet in towns near scholarly monasteries, a quieter realization emerged. Switch the grain, choose wheat over rye, and the curse vanished mysteriously. Sadly, wheat remained scarce and costly, a refuge for the privileged alone. You set down your bread, your hand still trembling from lingering spasms, and understand this enemy cannot be seen. The deepest injustice of ergot was this: while the powerful ate clean white loaves, the poor risk their sanity simply to survive another day. No doctrine or decree could explain the horror of being thrown out of ownership of one's own mind. That is the true dread of ergot, turning the meal that keeps you alive into the doorway that unravels you. Across Europe's long history, the burning blood spread fear of a dark miracle stalking the countryside. Today we call its chemicals alkaloids, ancestors of modern mind-altering drugs. But to the medieval world it was a brutal reality. Even food could make you lose yourself. In a time when bodies were forbidden to fail, minds forbidden to collapse, and bread itself could betray you. Surviving a single ordinary day became an achievement, and ergot, lurking in the harvest, whispered that sometimes evil does not come from hell, it comes from the field outside your door. while ergot slipped into daily bread and twisted perception in secret, another natural intoxicant worked more softly, sweeter, yet equally dangerous. Mad honey. Honey born from rhododendron blooms containing their own hidden poison. In the mountain regions where the flowers grew thick, bees gathered nectar and made a honey unlike any other. To the unknowing, it tasted like a blessing of the earth. You let a drop touch your tongue. Intense sweetness blooms quickly, but within minutes your heartbeat slows, heat floods your temples, and the world's brightness shifts, as if someone subtly rewired reality. Folk medicine praised mad honey as a rare cure for pain, cough, digestion, and restless nerves. A tiny dose relaxed muscles, coaxed sleep into cold homes where the wind clawed endlessly through timber walls, but one drop extra, and visions arrived. Someone watching from unreachable angles, a presence felt just out of sight. Suddenly, honey was no longer a gift. Mediterranean merchants once recorded sailors staggering across ship decks after tasting such honey, seeing ocean waves as giant hands reaching to drag them under. You grip the rail, salt and sweetness still on your tongue, as your heart struggles to remember its proper rhythm. With such power to disrupt flesh and thought, mad honey soon became a weapon. In a famed battle on Europe's eastern mountains, retreating locals left jars of rhododendron honey along the path. The pursuing army, hungry and exhausted, devoured it without hesitation. Moments later, convulsions, confusion, hallucination, formation shattered. The locals returned, struck fast and won without a single arrow loosed at the start. Honey, not steel, delivered the first blow. This shows medieval people were not only victims of nature, they learned to wield it. Mountain healers understood mad honey was not for casual use. They gave it sparingly, always watching the patient's eyes after each drop. But those without knowledge, or merchants chasing profit, turned sweetness into curse. The church and civic authorities left few records, for this was not a poison exposed in courtrooms or chapels, but one encountered quietly in simple meals where rumour replaced scholarship. Like all consciousness-shifting substances, mad honey's nature changed with circumstance, miracle or menace depending on intent. People used it to sleep, to soothe, to soften life's burden. They did not seek visions, they collided with them while searching for comfort. You rest against the wooden wall, the honey's warmth still echoing through your senses, every sound reverberating inside your skull. And in that moment you understand. Even the sweetest thing can pull a person farther from themselves than they ever wished to go. Mad honey became a soft yet cutting reminder of history. Nature does not distinguish medicine from poison. Humans must learn that distinction themselves. And in an age where survival relied on constant gamble, sometimes a single drop of honey was enough to decide the boundary between healing and sinking into darkness. After tales of honey tampered with by nature in the northern world, we turn our gaze eastward, where the alteration of consciousness was not only for easing pain or escaping reality, but believed to be a doorway to God. Hashish, made from the cannabis plant, entered Middle Eastern life through desert caravan routes and maritime trade linking the Islamic world to South Asia. Long before modern prejudice reshaped its image, hashish held a layered, complex role. In the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, where knowledge, philosophy and faith converged, hashish appeared in medical texts, poetry and legal writing. Some physicians viewed it as a relaxant and pain reliever. Meanwhile, the followers of Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, embraced it as a tool to expand perception, to listen inwardly, and to brush closer to the presence of the divine. You sit among the Sufis as they gather. Drums pulse. Voices circle in rhythm. and a slow breath drawn from passing smoke aligns your heartbeat with the meditative whirl. No one calls it hallucination. They call it the opening of the heart. Along the Silk Road, merchants carried hashish as a profitable trade good, travelling beside spices, silk, manuscripts, and rumours of strange states of mind that Western scholars heard only in fragments. In some places, hashish was even sold openly in the earliest coffee houses of the world, where men debated politics, poetry, and theology beneath Islamic domes. Yet because hashish touched the realm of spirituality, it became a subject of fragile debate. Islamic scholars and jurists disagreed. Some condemned it as a moral hazard, weakening the will and leading believers astray from the Quran. Others argued it could aid contemplation if used with right intention. You feel a warm current slide along your spine. The Sufi poetry, in a language unknown to you, still resonates clearly in your thoughts, while the drifting smoke turns lantern light into a slow, living breath. No one around you appears lost or reckless. They descend simply into a peace that life rarely allowed them to reach. But hashish did not remain enclosed in the sacred. History entangled it with politics and myth, stories twisted and magnified by rivals, enough to give the cannabis plant an aura of danger and mystery to European eyes. As knowledge of the substance spread to the West through crusades and trade, it was interpreted less as healing and more as threat, cited in moral condemnations as a destroyer of discipline and order. You set your mint tea down, the featherlight feeling still floating behind your forehead, and wonder how one substance could be a path to enlightenment in one land, yet denounced as heresy in another. The answer lies in the power of interpretation. Who holds the right to define the spiritual? Who decides which altered states are holy and which are forbidden? Hashish sat at the crossroads of commerce, faith, and authority, revealing an eternal truth of medieval history. Anything that touches the human mind instantly becomes a question of power. Whether praised as remedy or feared as corruption, hashish showed that everywhere, from European monasteries to Sufi lodges, humans sought to slip beyond the boundaries of the tangible world, and in the long night of history, sometimes a single breath of smoke was enough to make them believe they were stepping just a little closer to truth. While hashish and other mind-softening substances remained largely tied to Eastern spiritual and commercial centres, in medieval Europe daily survival rested in the hands of people without titles, without books, yet holding a kind of knowledge everyone relied upon: midwives and cunning folk, the women and folk healers who preserved herbal wisdom across generations. They treated illness with leaves gathered behind the garden, brought down fevers, healed wounds, and above all delivered children into a world where every birth was a step along the border of death. You sit in a cramped room. A woman's cries rise and fall like waves, and the midwife grips your hand with a steadiness that feels impossible, as though fear has long since grown familiar to her. She knows which herbs calm pain, how to turn the baby's position, when the body should wait, and when urgency must rule. This knowledge came not from parchment, but from observation, trial, and memory, a form of science not yet given a name. Yet because of this, they stood on a razor's edge, trusted when successful, suspected when they failed. The more small miracles occurred in their hands, the more watchful the eyes around them became. They knew pennyroyal could end a pregnancy, sweet herbs could lull sleep, mandrake could numb pain, that knowledge could save lives. But in the eyes of the church, it also looked like power outside the approved order. You watch her rummage through a leather pouch filled with leaves and roots absent from any monastery manuscript, and you understand. This power does not belong to clergy or crown. It belongs to those who live daily beside the suffering of their community, In such conditions, any unusual reaction to a treatment, any hint of hallucination, any frightening dream, could become the spark for a witchcraft accusation. The church and civil authority feared that those who held the secrets of life, especially women, might challenge the order built above them. So the very act called God's mercy yesterday could be condemned as devil's work tomorrow, all because a death arrived at the wrong moment, or a witness feared what they could not explain. These healers lived in history's grey zone. No one denied the lives they saved, but no one protected them when the crowd demanded blame. You squeeze the midwife's hand. There is certainty in her eyes, a calm that no distant priest or official could ever provide. They, not the power far away, understood the body through intimacy with fear and pain endured nightly by their own neighbours, and that is precisely why they were feared. Many witch hunts began with something ordinary: a failed birth, a patient's delirium, or a woman who knew too much about the plants growing at her doorstep. Medieval society would not permit women to hold knowledge beyond control, especially knowledge touching life and death. Jealousy, fear, and authority easily united against them. Yet despite all this, they continued their work, because without them, dozens would die, infants would never cry, and the suffering would remain untouched by any comforting hand. They were proof that practical science existed long before science had a name, that salvation often came from the very hands society distrusted most, and when history tried to draw a stark border between the sacred and the heretical, it was these grey-cloaked healers who showed that border was so thin, one single failure could stain it entirely black. After witnessing all the ways medieval people altered their consciousness, from pain-easing herbs to numbing ointments to incense that soothed the soul, you realize a single, unifying truth. The mind was never allowed to be simply natural. It was always judged, categorized, and monitored through the lens of society. In that age, who had the right to explain what happened inside a human's mind? The answer almost always was the church and those in power. When a priest claimed to hear the voice of God, his words were recorded carefully and reverently. But when a humble villager spoke of visions seen during a drug-induced trance, they were viewed as a threat to order. You feel your heartbeat rise as you recall the suspicious looks cast towards someone who just experienced hallucination. No one asks why it happened. They only ask whether it fits into what is allowed to be believed. The thoughts of common people were acceptable only if kept within religious boundaries. Step one shade beyond, and they became dangerous. During witch trials and heresy hunts across Europe, countless accusations began from symptoms triggered by medicines or natural chemicals. Trembling, sleep-talking, seeing strange shapes, or dancing without control. Understanding was unnecessary. Fear was enough. And fear always became action. You stand in a crowd, unsure whether to see the bound figure before you as a victim of illness, or someone claimed by demons. Your uncertainty reveals the deepest injustice. The same altered state of consciousness could be interpreted completely differently, depending on who experienced it. Clergy and nobility could drink strong ale in their halls, drifting freely into elevated mental states without judgment. Meanwhile, a villager who merely sought a night of peaceful sleep through herbs risked condemnation. You close your eyes, steadying your breath, and understand that fear of these substances says far less about their danger, and far more about how fragile one's place in the hierarchy truly was. History shows us that from the Middle East to Europe, from taverns to cathedrals, the desire to slip briefly away from suffering was a fundamental part of being alive. But the right to do so, and to be forgiven for it, was never shared equally. What was labelled witchcraft was often nothing more than the weak trying to survive. Looking back, we see that medieval people did not seek to drown themselves in illusion. They were simply trying to endure a reality constantly threatening to crush them. In the quiet battle between pain and hope, oppression and the longing to exist intact, they chose whatever helped them continue. A drop of honey, a cup of beer, a bitter leaf, a curl of fragrant smoke, or a whispered prayer. These substances, sometimes forbidden, sometimes exalted, reveal a simple truth. Humans have always tried to rescue themselves first, and only afterward listen to the commands of society. And just like them, we do the same today, each of us holding a private method for withstanding the weight of life. The most profound change is merely this: we now have the language of science to describe it. They had nothing but faith and courage. But beneath it all, we're not so different. Humans always find a way to keep going, even when conditions insist they cannot. In the Middle Ages, the world was endlessly uncertain. War, plague, famine, and darkness made an ordinary day feel like an ordeal. There was no modern science, no anxiety medication, no promise that tomorrow would be kinder. Yet they still sought a few moments apart from pain, whether through herbs, wine, honey, or through religion itself. You rest a hand upon your chest, feeling the heartbeat remind you that the body's always trying to move forward, just as theirs once did. They were not trying to escape reality, they were trying to adjust it so that the mind would not break. What mattered was never the substance they used, but the reason they needed it to survive. Yet history reveals a difficult truth. The very same spiritual experience could lead to completely different fates, depending on who experienced it and what society permitted. The powerful used alcohol to reinforce authority, praised and accepted. The weak sought sleep through herbs and were easily condemned as misguided. You look back at the faces in this story and see that each of them was simply trying to protect what little remained of their inner world. Hidden beneath all of this lies a lesson for us today. No one deserves judgment for trying to survive. Whether in the Middle Ages or in our modern time, the mind has always borne the heaviest burdens. We now have science, medicine, electric light, and technology. Yet we still face days so exhausting that we wish to step away from the world even briefly. That does not make us weak. It makes us human, just like those who lived before us. You close your eyes for a moment and exhale slowly, realizing a simple truth. We can learn from medieval people that existence itself is a victory, requiring neither brilliance nor power. Even if the world outside remains shadowed, a single small comfort, a warm cup of tea, a soft piece of music, a deep enough sleep can carry us across the long night. The history of mind-altering substances is not a history of downfall, but a history of human beings choosing life despite the darkness around them. And we, by enduring each day, are the longest continuation of that story.